Thank you for coming to our session. We weren't expecting such a great turnout. I just wanted to let everyone know that we will have time for Q&A. So I'm expecting this to be a topic that many people will want to get into, so we will have time for peer sharing and Q&A at the end. So let's get started. We want to take a moment to first consider the events happening in our world today. In particular, the conflict in Israel and Palestine, in which so many innocent people have lost their lives. So let us dare to imagine and work towards a more peaceful future and observe a moment of silence in recognition of what's happening. Okay. We're going to start with introducing ourselves, and we're going to introduce ourselves in the context of our futures practices. And one of the things that we talked about is that the three of us see the future in very different ways. We work on very different time scales, and that's kind of a distinguishing feature. So the near future, the medium-term future, and the far future. So I will start with Ahradieh. Why don't you begin?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name's Ahradieh Krishnan, and I'm a risk anticipation and strategic foresight expert, predominantly working with multilateral organizations and governments. I would say that I very much work with the near, sometimes pushing midterm future, but take that away, it's probably around the 5 to 8 year time frame. And the reason for that is what my work and the work that I do with my stakeholders is around understanding what risk looks like and how it is changing and what is emerging in the space of risk, how it interacts with each other, and then in terms of for multilateral organizations and governments, what kind of policy investments do we need to make now in order to either mitigate against or prevent regression in terms of the gains we've made. So it is near term, 5 to 8 years. 10 would already be too long for government decision makers and senior stakeholders.
Thanks. And I guess I will say that I am Alicia. I'm the Futures Lead at Forum for the Future, which is a sustainability nonprofit that looks at how to bring about a just and regenerative future with our partner organizations. Most of the work that I do with Forum is with companies and with philanthropies and foundations. And so I would say very much in the medium-term future of about 7 to 17 years. So I'm calculating in my mind out to 2040. And simply because that's when a lot of climate commitments have been made for 2030 and 2040. And a lot of companies have set ambitious targets towards 2040 goals. So a lot of our work is in bridging that gap of that kind of medium-term space and how to strategize an action plan around that future.
So the first question, and we're doing this as a bit of a fireside chat, so it's not a traditional panel, by the way, if we haven't made that clear. So to my colleagues, what does good futures look like to you in your work in a very chaotic present? Alicia?
Oh, so I think to me, I think given the amount of chaos and disruption that we all see, good futures is a couple of things. One, I do think that part of good futures is about practical action planning around the future. So tangible steps, I think sometimes we can punt things to the future. So at least with or companies, it's easy to set goals for 2040 because that is a long way away. And sometimes pushing things into too far into the future prevents us from taking action or taking courageous and ambitious action in the present. So I think that that's one aspect of kind of good futures plans for multiple things, multiple steps along the process. And I also think that it's definitely less about forecasting change and more about navigating change. So at Forum, we do a lot of work on the difficult work around mindset shifts, and we have a trajectories model for change, kind of stepping similar to doing scenarios, but really looking at what are the mindsets that pervade certain actions about the world today, and how, and especially around climate, where we know something's happening, but people aren't taking the steps needed to prevent it or to change course. How do you really get into shifting people's mindsets? And to me, that is really at the heart of kind of good futuring is, futures for action, getting people to do stuff.
So, I mean, I guess I'll preface this by saying my constituents and stakeholders usually exist in very bureaucratic, very risk-averse environments. I can see my UN colleagues in the room all nodding their heads. So, there's a couple of perspectives here that I've woven into our practice, into the systems we build within our organizations. So the first is that, how do we understand how change happens? We can produce the best trends reports, the best scenarios, if it is not linked into what would prompt our decision makers to make a different type of decision that has a viable value proposition for them to make that decision, then it's just a really nice report. To understand that, we need to understand the internal systems, the pipes, the how your institution works, and also what your risk appetite is. If you're and which is why in my space, it's never 12 years into the future is too far. 8 years is tricky. 5 years is comfortable. But if we can make change within that 5 years, then that is really profoundly different for us. The second thing is, and we were discussing this over breakfast, in my space, our constituents, our stakeholders have ambitious near-term, are ambitious in their near-term objectives, but more careful about their longer-term objectives. And what I mean by that is, sometimes when we say we want, there are these sort of nebulous phrases, eliminate gender violence, we want peace on earth, etc., and we put this random year next to it. But in fact, the steps that we're taking in the 5 years doesn't actually match up to that. It becomes, and so we tend to become really ambitious in that 5 years without necessarily thinking or linking that 5-year plan to our moonshot ambition. Thirdly, good futures, a good foresight practice to me is one which is decentralized. So it cannot be your classic technical team that flies in and out, maintains the expertise. If we cannot decentralize the expertise to all our country offices, to all our people, and not make this seem like a really tough scientific, which it isn't, practice to do, then we're never going to be successful. And then the fourth is, yes, we exist in the space of crises and risk. We do that. But we don't do that to make us continuously feel a sense of despair or dystopia. Because hope is an act of resistance. So we talk about what is coming our way and how do we be better prepared for it, to have resistance, to activate our need for action, to stand up and say, I need to start planning and mitigating this thing that may or may not happen 10 years from now. I need to make some different decisions today. And if I need to make some different decisions today, I need to be able to influence my decision makers within a risk framework that they appreciate. I need to demonstrate what the trade-off is going to be between investing into firefighting X today versus investing into something for tomorrow, and why this is valuable. And the final point I'll make, to me, and building on what my colleagues have said, it's been really integral in our practice to achieve justice. But how to achieve justice in futures and foresight work is to mitigate the harm that can come out of the work we do. And what I mean by that is, if we're only providing very echo chamber worldviews of visions, we are replicating a specific worldview. If we're only having a certain group of experts facilitating discussions from one part of the world to the other, we're not listening. We're creating in our own image. And these are practices that are deeply colonial and harmful. And so to me, what's been in really good futures is it decentralized? Is it linking to what decision makers feel they can do? Have we got a good trade-off in risk analysis about why it's important? Does it reduce the harm that can inevitably arise out of the actions we take? And have we contributed to that harm? And as a expert practitioner, etc., when do I know it's time to go?
My point was just that in addition to justice, I think we need sustainability. So I just think now, in this day and age, if you're doing a futures process or any kind of futures work and you're not thinking about justice, equity, and sustainability/regeneration, something is wrong. Like, even if you're looking at the future of dog food, trust me, there is something you need to be looking at with regards to those three issues. So I think that is just the baseline of futuring in the world today that needs to be acknowledged and explicitly written into every kind of futures process. I think that also, to your point, Ahradieh, I do think that there is a large capacity for people, and this came up on a previous panel that I was on for imagination and creativity, and they're not often given the spaces in which to do that about the future. So it's not that we need tons more experts. I don't think that's the case. But I do think that just as people are processing the present, they need spaces, safe spaces, where they can just be held to be creative about the future in a way that won't get them fired or laughed at or any of that. So what kind of good futures is giving people that space and kind of giving them the support that they need to be the person who's then saying, hey, maybe we need to rethink part of our business model, and I know you guys are going to like that, or maybe we need to do something really risky to achieve the future that we want to achieve.
No, I love that, and I'm just reflecting on what you just said, because again, in the space that I work in, the concept of what counts as evidence matters. And does imagination count as evidence to senior political decision makers? And we did a practice, I would say 2 years ago, where we blended, it was called Inclusive Imaginaries, and we blended imagination practices from the Global South with academically written foresight briefs, and then to try and draw the thread between all of them to demonstrate that this is a valuable source of evidence as a baseline for our decision makers was really difficult. And so I often compare and contrast different stakeholder groups, and where imagination is higher on the acceptance as evidence and where imagination is lesser. I mean, this is the bane of my work because governments and political decision makers and policy decision makers, we have, all of us really, we only have finite investments. We only have a finite financial budget. So you're asking policymakers and decision makers to make a decision on solving problem X in front of them right now, which very often is linked to either electoral cycles, to a certain funding window or whatever. It's linked to a very specific thing versus mitigating something that may or may not happen. And that's the trick, isn't it? Like, it may or may not happen. And ultimately, these are perceptions of what might happen into the future, perceptions of risk, the weighting. That's what the global risk report from WEF is. It's a perceptions analysis. And we're asking to use that as an evidence base. So it is really, really hard. The sort of language or the way I've been working to influence change in this space is twofold. That leadership now no longer has the luxury of prioritizing just today or just tomorrow. That time is gone. Leadership in uncertainty, if you want to lead in this space, you want to be a senior decision maker in the space, requires leaders that can juggle the two and balance the two. So we need to find collectively and make the types of investment choices that say, I still have to solve problem X, but I want to mitigate problem A, B, C, D, E from creating more unjust, less developed, less progress, less harm towards my communities in the future. So I also need to invest into that. And the thing that we have to do, I've had to do a lot of, is to do a trade-off analysis. If we do this, this is what we're trading off. And you have to make a decision, and you have to stand by the decision that says, I will invest into this and trade off doing that. And that's really, really hard, because often, as all of us know, we want to just, we never answer the question, what must gracefully die so that the right thing can exist? And we're very bad at just stopping doing something. We just keep doing it like hamsters in the wheel. So those are really difficult conversations to have. It requires the ability to hold people's trust in the palm of your hands, but also be able to, at least in my world, demonstrate to our constituents and stakeholders why it is absolutely valuable and integral to invest into something that may or may not happen in language that our stakeholders understand.
So one of the things that we did around this issue of almost helping decision makers make better decisions about the future, we recently partnered with the foundation to come up with a game, and it's like a small tabletop analog game, because of this very issue, that we were working with a group of foundations, and they came with the question of, do we fund X or Y? As much as we would like to say we'll fund everything, you can only fund so many things and prioritize so many things, otherwise you're spread too thin. So how do we do that? And specifically, this was about the energy transition. And so we were like, well, we can take all of this research and present it to you in a report, and then off you go and make the decisions now that you've been steeped in the research. Or we can turn the research into a game, and you can kind of talk about option A versus option B, and there's consequences, with stakeholders depending on what option you take. And the game was really helpful in getting there, just because of this very issue of it's really hard for people to say, do I deal with the present crisis, or do I deal with the established way of solving the problem, such as world hunger, let's say, just a big topic, or do I invest in the niche solutions? Is it a supply issue? Do I deal with the demand issue? How are you figuring out how to do that? And I think it's really messy, and I do think that people need to think through that, and generally that's what organizations struggle with in terms of balancing those two. It's of how are we kind of creating an investment portfolio or a portfolio of our interests so that we can balance those.
We're going to ask you to take a minute to absorb what you've heard, and how does it feel in your body? What emotions does it bring up? And we'd love for you to take a minute to do that, and then to peer share with somebody sitting next to you for 3 minutes each. Just talk about that, and then we'll bring it back for Q&A.
Good afternoon. My name is Jacob Ellis. I work at the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and I'm one of the many Future Generations Global Ambassadors that are in the room today. I really value the question on current crises, which is sort of short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. The only reflection I wanted to add to the mix was I think you can do both, and I'm not quite sure if that came through in the discussion earlier, that you can find these win-win scenarios. So one of the many challenges that many people face across the world is a housing crisis. And one of the things that we can do in terms of short-term and long-term is, think about what type of building are we creating, tackling decarbonisation and heat and poverty in terms of access to energy, gives green jobs, therefore good for current people. So I think there are many thematic policy examples that if we can find the balance, that would be good. But if I can throw a question in, is how can we represent those that are not yet born? So in Wales, we have a context of an independent Future Generations Commissioner, but in order to try and get through to parliamentarians and governments, I think we do need to address that core question of how do we represent people that are not yet born, and doing that meaningfully.
Thank you very much for the great setting of the stage of the mind. My name is Salma Abbasi, and I'm a professor of AI and ethical entrepreneurship. One of the things that I was talking with my colleague in cybersecurity is the future. I come from the UK, and we are dealing with 14-year-olds and 12-year-olds stabbing each other. So we're trying to work with the local authorities to create safe spaces for children to talk about the future. And what I'm worried about is the level of violence. I'm old. When I was young, it was all cartoons and happy things and romantic movies. Every single aspect of our entertainment and our surrounding, even the music, the videos, it's all violent. And young children at the age of 8 are on games and all the time with God knows who they engage with. So the future I'm trying to anticipate is, without sounding soppy, was a happy future, positive future, safe future. And how to get to that space with all the negative digital environment that is making billions, so it's hard to control. That's my question.
Hi, my name is Richard Xu. I'm from Shanghai, University of Chongqing. 3 different points. You brought up a lot of things that made me think quite a bit. The first one, the wide variety choices of future. Absolutely, just like there are wide varieties of cultures, people, and ages. But what if there's a group of people that are thinking about a few primary principles that is good for everyone, and everybody use them as a core to go forward from, so that the future looks unified and good for the world, but it has its own personalities. The second one, we talk about evidence. The greatest people on earth with evidence are planetary elders, our great-great-great-grandfathers, cultures that are 1,000, 2,000 years old. But very seldom that we see groups of futurism or foresight that we actually listen and speak to elders. Because how is it for us to look at Long Now Foundation 10,000 years or 1,000 years if we're so narrow-minded to what's on our phone and on our laptop?
I mean, I can be very brief in saying that I think that bringing elders into the conversation and bringing the unborn into the conversation are 2 sides of the same coin. So both of those things need to happen. And for both of those things to happen, it is kind of a step away from tech optimism, from linear prosperity trajectory to one in which we're considering the uniformity, the interweaving of past, present, and future, so that we're learning from the past and we're bringing past practices to bear when they're useful, and we're also considering the needs of future generations. So I think that those can be kind of tackled in the same way, and I don't know the solution space as well in terms of the commissions or what could be set up, but I do think that that's really, really critical.
I might tackle the digital one. Look, the reality is we exist in a space and time of violence. And violence presents itself in a variety of ways. It's the physical violence that happens. It's, I would even argue that spaces that privilege expertise is a form of violence because you're denying experience, intelligence to groups of people. How do we promote then a hopeful future when everything around us is so hard? And I think beyond just the digital space, I mean, that's a question for our time, isn't it? We are all feeling really, really anxious. Everything is really painful right now. And it's really hard to think about 10, 20, 30 years into the future. A lot of my work has occurred in fragile spaces. So one of the challenges I've had to work through and reflect in our practice is, how do you talk about the future when people are vulnerable, people are feeling fragile? When you can't put food on the table, how do you talk about global prosperity? If your children are being killed, how are you talking about a peaceful future? And therefore, coming back, Sarah, to your point, the values that underpin the human values that we should be unified and towards working towards. I wonder, and it's a genuine question I'm working through, I don't have an answer. At this point of time, the global norms that have governed our world that we signed up to post-World War II is fast being thrown out the door, right? The sort of global social contract we thought we were signing up to, it's gone. So what must replace it? Coming from a humanitarian background, must we still remain neutral in the face of such violence? And I would argue no. We cannot remain neutral. To prevent the unfolding of continuous harm and continuous violence, we must see our course of action today as a form of resistance. I resist the continuation of a status quo that privileges only a certain few and the disempowerment and the disenfranchisement of others. I am resisting a continued explosion of our planetary boundaries because that is at the expense of groups of populations that are already minoritized and disenfranchised. So to me, understanding violence, understanding risk, understanding all the bad things that happen in the world and is likely to occur are actually the very basis of the wicked problems of our time. Wicked problems aren't climate change, all this. Wicked problems are the structural centers of injustice that have pervaded our humanity. And to think about the future and work against, working towards mitigating those continuation of that violence is my act of hope for the future, because that's what I'm working towards.